In 1965, when America was caught in the heat of the civil rights struggle and the air of revolution was thick, Malcolm X was preparing to give one of his most pivotal speeches in Harlem. His words were poised to shake the very foundation of racial oppression. But a shadow had been cast over the event, one that sought to silence him before he could speak. Assassins had been sent to kill Malcolm. They weren't just any hired guns. They were part of a larger conspiracy to stop the voice of Black liberation from growing louder. Their mission was clear: eliminate the threat, and the civil rights movement would lose one of its most powerful leaders. But what these men didn't know was that Harlem wasn't just any place. It was the heart of Black power, and its protector wasn't just a name on the streets. Bumpy Johnson, a legend in his own right, was about to make sure that Malcolm X would not fall that night. As the assassins surrounded the hall, preparing to take action before the speech even began, they never imagined that they would come face to face with the razor-sharp justice of Harlem's most untouchable man. Bumpy had always kept his word, and tonight, he was about to show just how far he would go to protect those who stood for the cause. Malcolm X was a man who didn't just speak truth, he embodied it. His charisma, his intellect, and his unwavering commitment to the cause of Black empowerment made him a target for both external and internal enemies. From his days in prison to his rise as one of the most prominent leaders of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm had always been a revolutionary in the eyes of those who saw change as a threat. But it wasn't just his words that had made Malcolm a threat. It was his ability to unite, to inspire, and to command the power of Black America. His message wasn't just about freedom, it was about dignity. It was about demanding respect. And that made him more dangerous than any political figure or white supremacist group. The assassins, on the other hand, were shadows, hired by those who feared Malcolm's growing influence. They were nothing more than pawns in a much larger game. They were trained men, cold and calculating, used to carrying out hits with efficiency. They had been given orders to infiltrate Harlem and take Malcolm out before he could speak. But they underestimated one key thing: the power of Harlem itself and the man who ruled its streets, Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was a protector, a man who knew the streets, who understood that Harlem wasn't just a place, it was a movement. And that movement was something Bumpy would fight for with everything he had. Bumpy's influence stretched far beyond the numbers game or the rackets he ran. It reached into the very soul of Harlem. He knew that Malcolm, despite his differences with the Nation of Islam, was part of the larger struggle for freedom and dignity, and no one would silence him on his watch. The real conflict wasn't just about Malcolm's life, it was about the larger battle for Black liberation. The threat against Malcolm X symbolized the forces that had always tried to crush the voice of Black America. These forces weren't just institutional, they were deeply personal. Every time a leader rose, there were those who would do whatever it took to bring them down. The assassins didn't just want to silence Malcolm. They wanted to stop the momentum of the civil rights movement before it could gain any more traction. They had seen what had happened to other leaders, how the system used violence to snuff out hope. But what they didn't know was that their plan was about to backfire. For Bumpy Johnson, this wasn't just a matter of personal protection. It was about his community, his people. Harlem wasn't just a collection of streets. It was the heart of the resistance. Bumpy had fought too hard to allow someone to come into Harlem and threaten the very essence of Black power, especially not while Malcolm was there to speak. The moral line had been crossed when the assassins decided that it was okay to take Malcolm's life just to maintain the status quo. But Bumpy wasn't about to let that stand. The black community had fought too long and too hard for freedom to let it be extinguished by an assassination plot. The stakes weren't just Malcolm's life. They were the future of Harlem, the future of Black America, and the future of the civil rights movement itself. Bumpy knew that this confrontation was inevitable. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about justice. And justice in Harlem was swift and uncompromising. The assassins had made their move, but now they were going to learn the price of crossing a man like Bumpy Johnson. It started when Malcolm X arrived at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem on the night of February 21st, 1965. The air was thick with anticipation as hundreds of black men and women gathered, ready to hear one of the most powerful voices of the civil rights movement speak. Malcolm's words had been resonating across the country, and tonight he was about to drop another truth bomb. But in the shadows, the assassins were already moving. They had infiltrated the ballroom hours before, blending in with the crowd. Disguised as patrons, they quietly positioned themselves near the stage where Malcolm would stand. Their mission was clear: terminate the threat before he could take the podium. Vincent "the Shadow" Bellini, one of the assassins and a seasoned hitman for a rival faction within the Nation of Islam, was in place. He watched as Malcolm's security team made their final checks. Bellini knew the clock was ticking. Malcolm was just moments away from speaking, and with him, the power to ignite a movement. Malcolm was in his element, walking through the ballroom, greeting supporters, and preparing to address the crowd. He had no idea of the imminent danger that lurked just feet away from him. But that's when Bumpy's men, led by T-Bone and Slim, began to make their move. They weren't just watching, they were waiting for the right moment. They had learned that Vincent Bellini, a former ally turned assassin, had been seen in the neighborhood days before. This wasn't just a coincidence, it was a direct threat against Malcolm X, and Harlem wouldn't stand for it. Bumpy Johnson had always kept his ears to the ground. He knew when trouble was brewing, and he had long ago promised to protect Malcolm when needed. What Bellini and his crew didn't know was that Bumpy had eyes everywhere. His network stretched far beyond Harlem, and on that night, it was his watchful eyes that would stop the violence before it could happen. As the assassins prepared to strike, the phone call came through to Bumpy Johnson. He was sitting in his office, calm as ever, when the voice on the other end told him exactly what was about to unfold. "Bumpy," the voice said, "the assassins are in place. They're going after Malcolm." Bumpy sat back in his chair, his fingers stroking the smooth surface of the razor he always carried. The weight of the moment didn't faze him. In fact, his response was almost serene. "They think they can just take what's ours?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He knew that the attack wasn't just on Malcolm. It was an attack on everything he had worked to protect. The very idea of someone coming into Harlem and thinking they could just erase a man like Malcolm X without consequence was unacceptable. "I'll take care of it," Bumpy said, his voice calm but unwavering. "Bumpy, we've got men ready to handle the situation," his lieutenant replied. But Bumpy was already thinking ahead. He didn't trust anyone else to handle this. Malcolm's life wasn't a gamble he was willing to let others take. "I'm going in," Bumpy said, closing his eyes for a brief moment. His mind was already racing with the steps he needed to take. He wasn't just going to let the assassins pull off a hit on his watch. Not in Harlem. Not while Malcolm X was about to speak for the people who needed him most. As the minutes ticked down, the tension in the ballroom was palpable. Malcolm X had taken the stage. The crowd was still, waiting for him to speak. The spotlight was on him. He stepped up to the podium, and the silence stretched, heavy with anticipation. He was about to remind the world of the black man's fight for justice, dignity, and equality. But as the clock struck closer to the hour, the assassins were getting ready to make their move. Outside, Bumpy's men were in position. They had spread out through the crowd, blending in, but never losing sight of their mission. Bumpy knew that the threat had to be removed without disrupting the speech. Malcolm's voice had to be heard. But if they didn't act quickly, the assassins would make their move before anyone had the chance to stop them. Inside the ballroom, the assassins had already begun to make their way toward the stage. Their plan was simple: get close enough to Malcolm, and when the moment was right, make their move. But they couldn't anticipate the precision with which Bumpy had planned his intervention. As Malcolm began to speak, his words powerful, rising with the intensity that had made him one of the most feared orators in America, the assassins moved. They thought they had the element of surprise, until they didn't. Just as one of them stepped forward with his gun drawn, a blinding flash of movement caught the room's attention. The assassins never saw it coming. In one fluid motion, T-Bone had knocked the gun from the hand of the nearest man. Slim had already disarmed another, his sharp eyes spotting the smallest movements of danger. And then, in the back of the room, Bumpy Johnson stepped forward. His figure was like a force of nature. The man they had heard rumors about, the man who ran the streets, had come to protect what was his. With calm precision, Bumpy moved through the crowd. As the assassins realized what was happening, they froze. The sound of footsteps approaching them was the only thing they could hear. There was no escape. "I'm going to tell you something once." Bumpy's voice rang clear through the room. "You take one more step, and it'll be the last one you ever take. This ain't your fight, and it never will be." The assassins froze, unable to process the reality of the situation. They had underestimated Harlem, and more specifically, they had underestimated Bumpy Johnson. In the dim light of the ballroom, the air grew thick with tension as Bumpy's footsteps echoed against the floor. The assassins, now caught in the web Bumpy had spun, felt the weight of the situation descend on them. They were no longer the hunters, they were the prey. Malcolm, unaware of the threat that had been looming over him, continued his speech. His voice was steady, his words ringing with the power of conviction. "The struggle for freedom doesn't come easy," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd, not knowing how close he had come to being silenced forever. As Bumpy moved closer, one of the assassins, John the Butcher Calloway, the leader of the group, made a last-ditch effort. He reached for his weapon, but before he could pull it from his coat, Bumpy's hand was already on him. In a flash, Bumpy's razor-sharp blade was at his throat, an extension of his reputation, a symbol of the justice he dispensed without hesitation. "Don't move," Bumpy whispered, his voice low, menacing. "You made one fatal mistake tonight. You thought you could kill a king and no one would notice. You thought you could silence a revolution without consequences. Well, this is where it ends." The room went silent. The other assassins, now standing in a circle with Bumpy at the center, realized they were trapped. No one in Harlem would let them leave. Bumpy had them cornered, and he wasn't about to let them walk out of there with blood on their hands. For a brief moment, John Calloway made eye contact with Bumpy. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there. A realization that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He had thought he could pull off the hit, but in the presence of Bumpy Johnson, there was no room for error. Bumpy didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, the blade was gone, and Calloway crumpled to the floor, his final breath escaping him. The others, frozen in terror, knew they were next. "You'll be lucky if I let you walk out of here at all," Bumpy said, his words cold and final. "But before you go, remember this: Harlem doesn't belong to you. It never will. You won't take Malcolm from us. Not tonight." The assassins, disarmed and desperate, were escorted out of the ballroom by Bumpy's men. T-Bone and Slim had already made sure no one would get in their way. They weren't just dealing with men who had tried to kill a leader. They were protecting the soul of Harlem itself. Malcolm, still unaware of the full extent of the danger he had faced, continued speaking to his audience, his voice resonating through the room. But now the crowd could feel the weight of what had just happened. They knew that something monumental had taken place. Malcolm X was not just speaking for the black community. He had been shielded by the very heart of Harlem. As the assassins were driven away, Bumpy stood in the doorway of the ballroom, his eyes scanning the streets outside. He knew this wouldn't be the last time someone would try to harm Malcolm. He also knew that he would always be there to stop it. Bumpy wasn't just protecting Malcolm. He was protecting the vision of black power that had given birth to leaders like him. The world outside the ballroom continued to turn, but in that moment, Harlem stood still. Bumpy Johnson had delivered justice with precision, making it clear that in his territory, there would be no room for the kind of violence that threatened the freedom of their people. Malcolm X would live to speak another day, and his message would continue to inspire generations to come. The assassination attempt on Malcolm X sent ripples through the civil rights movement, but it also cemented Bumpy Johnson's role as the protector of Harlem. The incident was a stark reminder to those who sought to oppress or silence black voices that Harlem was not a place where such attempts would go unnoticed or unpunished. Malcolm continued his work in the weeks and months that followed, but the memory of that night, of the silent yet deadly intervention of Harlem's king, would stay with him. Bumpy's actions had made a profound impact, not just on Malcolm, but on everyone who called Harlem home. It was a moment that solidified the understanding that the power of Harlem was indivisible from its history, its struggles, and its champions. For the assassins, it marked the end of their careers. Some fled, their faces hidden. Others disappeared altogether. But in the streets of Harlem, their names were forgotten, replaced by the story of the day when Bumpy Johnson's razor-sharp justice saved Malcolm X from a fate that could have changed the course of history. The community of Harlem spoke of that night in hushed tones, and Bumpy's legend only grew. He wasn't just the man who controlled the streets. He was the man who would do whatever it took to protect the voice of black freedom. If this story hit you, smash that subscribe button. We're telling the Bumpy Johnson stories that history forgot, the moments that made him a legend, the code that made him untouchable. Drop a like if you believe there's nothing more powerful than the protection of the truth. And in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Bumpy's shoes? Would you have stepped in to protect one of the most important voices of the civil rights movement? More legendary stories are coming next day. Don't miss it.